James Toney's career was built on fearlessness. Yet behind the highlight reels, there was one rival he could never shake. Decades later, at 53, Toney finally tells the story and reveals the name he tried to leave in the past. James Nathaniel Toney was born on August 24, 1968, in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Long before he was called Lights Out, he was a kid growing up in a rough environment where toughness was survival. He had the kind of upbringing where fights happened long before boxing gloves were involved. On the streets, Toney built a reputation as someone who didn't mess with. He was sharp-tongued, fearless, and never backed down. That edge later became part of his boxing personality. Toney didn't grow up dreaming of being the next Sugar Ray Leonard or Muhammad Ali. In fact, he admitted years later that he didn't take boxing seriously at first. But he had raw ability. He had the natural instinct to slip punches, roll with shots, and fire back with precision. Once he began training properly, it was clear he had something different. His amateur career wasn't long compared to others, but it was enough to get noticed. With just over 30 amateur fights, he transitioned into the professional ranks in 1988. That decision changed his life. From the start, Toney fought like he had been boxing for decades. His style didn't look like the flashy, bounce-on-your-feet boxers of his time. He fought out of a crouch, rolling his shoulders, tucking his chin, and making opponents miss by inches. He wasn't the fastest, but he was one of the smartest. He had an old-school look, like something out of the 1940s, using the shoulder roll and a slick counter-punching style that reminded fans of boxing legends such as Archie Moore. It didn't take long for people to realize that James Toney wasn't just good, but was a throwback to a different era of fighting. In 1991, only 3 years after turning professional, Toney shocked the boxing world. At just 22 years old, he faced Michael Nunn, the IBF middleweight champion, who was unbeaten at the time and heavily favored to win. Nunn's speed and height were supposed to overwhelm Toney, but the young challenger had other plans. After falling behind early, Toney stayed calm, waited for his chance, and in the 11th round, delivered a right hand that turned the fight. Nunn went down, the referee waved it off, and James Toney was the new champion of the world. That night, a star was born. Beyond winning the belt, Toney proved that his style worked against the very best. From there, he defended the title multiple times, including a memorable war with Mike McCallum, a veteran technician who tested him in ways few fighters could. Toney held his own and built a reputation as one of the smartest boxers in the game. But he didn't stop at middleweight. Toney climbed to super middleweight and then to cruiserweight, capturing titles along the way. By the mid-1990s, he had already established himself as a 3-division world champion. Later, he even made the jump to heavyweight, taking on men much larger than him and proving that his defensive skills worked no matter the weight class. Few fighters in history could claim that kind of versatility. What made James Toney special wasn't just the belts or the records. It was how he fought. He didn't rely on knockout power, although he had it when needed. He relied on making opponents miss, then making them pay. His shoulder roll defense, sharp counters, and ability to stay calm under fire made him one of the trickiest puzzles in boxing. He could stand right in front of you, look hittable, and yet slip your best shot and crack you back before you even knew what happened. This is why fighters respected him. They knew he wasn't flashy, but he was real. They knew he wasn't unbeatable, but he was unpredictable. James Toney was the fighter you didn't want to look bad against, because he had a way of exposing weaknesses. By the time he reached the heavyweight division, Toney had cemented himself as one of the toughest and smartest fighters of his era. He was called Lights Out. for good reason. But what really kept opponents up at night was trying to figure him out. And yet, despite all his success, despite all the titles and wars, there was still one man who left the deepest mark on him. And when James Toney finally speaks about that fighter, the name might surprise you. The tough opponent reveal. Fans who followed Toney's career knew one thing for sure. There weren't many men who could make James Toney look uncomfortable in a ring. But that doesn't mean it never happened. So who could? It was someone who made James Toney, the master of defensive boxing, feel like he was fighting against the future of the sport itself. That man was Roy Jones Jr. The year was 1994. Both men were in their prime. James Toney was the undefeated IBF super middleweight champion, carrying a record of 44-0-2. He was confident, brash, and slick. He was that fighter who could walk into a ring with anyone and believe he was going to walk out the winner. On the other side was Roy Jones Jr., the former Olympic silver medalist whose professional career had been building momentum with every fight. His combination of speed, reflexes, and athleticism was something boxing fans had never quite seen before. He could leap in with hooks, throw punches from odd angles, and get away with things other fighters wouldn't dare to try. Jones wasn't just beating opponents, he was embarrassing them. When the fight was announced for November 18, 1994, at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, fans knew it was something special. This wasn't just a title fight. It was a clash of two men considered nearly unbeatable. On one side, the old-school genius of James Toney. On the other, the futuristic brilliance of Roy Jones Jr. Toney came in confident, but there was one problem: the weight. In the lead-up to the fight, stories circulated about Toney struggling to make the 168-pound limit. He drained himself badly to get there. Some insiders said he looked flat in training, but Toney never made excuses. On fight week, he insisted he was ready. Jones, meanwhile, looked calm, focused, and ready to seize the biggest spotlight of his career. When the first bell rang, fans expected fireworks. What they got instead was a masterclass in speed and control from Roy Jones Jr. Right from the opening round, Jones's hand speed was obvious. He flicked his jab, darted in and out, and landed combinations before Toney could set himself. Toney tried to establish his shoulder roll defense, waiting for counters. But every time he thought he had Jones measured, the challenger was already gone. By round 3, the pattern was clear. Jones wasn't just fast, he was unpredictable. He'd throw a jab, then a hook, then leap in with a right hand that seemed to come out of nowhere. Toney, normally so composed, was forced onto the defensive more than usual. He wasn't panicking, but he wasn't dictating the fight either. In round 3, Jones even scored a knockdown. A quick left hook caught Toney as he was pulling back, and he hit the canvas. He rose immediately, more angry than hurt, but the message was undeniable. Jones could hurt him. From there, Jones grew more confident. He taunted, dropped his hands, and even mugged for the crowd between exchanges. The speed difference was shocking. Commentators at ringside, including George Foreman, couldn't stop talking about how Toney couldn't find his rhythm. As the rounds ticked by, the gap only widened. Jones controlled the pace, landed flashy combinations, and made Toney swing at air. Normally, it was Toney who made opponents miss. That night, he was the one missing. By the championship rounds, the result was clear. Toney was still standing, still tough, still trying to land that one counter to change the fight, but the moment never came. Jones was too fast, too sharp, too elusive. After 12 rounds, the scorecards told the story. A lopsided unanimous decision in favor of Roy Jones Jr. The undefeated record was gone. The IBF belt was gone. And perhaps more importantly, James Toney had just met the one fighter he couldn't fathom. For a man as proud as James Toney, the loss stung deeply. He wasn't used to being outclassed. Even when fights were close, he always felt like he had control. But against Jones, he admitted later, it felt different. In interviews years after the fight, Toney didn't mince words. He respected many of his opponents. He admired Holyfield's toughness, McCallum's craft, Rahman's strength. But when the question came about who the toughest overall fighter was, he pointed to Roy Jones Jr. "He was the fastest, sharpest fighter I ever faced," Toney admitted. That's high praise coming from a man like Toney. He had fought in every division from middleweight to heavyweight, faced men who outweighed him by 30 or 40 pounds, and still found ways to compete. But speed and reflexes, the kind Jones had, were the one thing he couldn't fully overcome. For Jones, the victory cemented his place as the best fighter in the world at that time. For Toney, it was a harsh lesson that even the slickest defense can be overwhelmed by speed on another level. Toney thrived on control. He could handle power. He could handle size. He could handle pressure. But Jones took away his sense of rhythm. He forced Toney to react instead of dictate. And for a fighter who lived off his ability to predict and counter, that was the ultimate form of discomfort. That's why years later, when asked about the toughest man he ever fought, James Toney didn't hesitate. It wasn't the brawlers, it wasn't the heavyweights, it wasn't the legends he beat. It was the man who made him look human in front of the world. But let's take a step back and look at the other people who might have probably given Toney a hard time in the ring. James Toney's battles. One of the names that James Toney has never stopped respecting was Mike McCallum. The body snatcher, as McCallum was fondly called, was a Jamaican technician with some of the best body punching in boxing history. And when he crossed paths with Toney in the early 90s, sparks flew. Their first meeting in 1991 at middleweight ended in a draw, but it was anything but a forgettable fight. McCallum went straight to the body and worked Toney over the way only he could. Toney was cut badly that night, one of the few times in his career he looked vulnerable. Still, he refused to fold, answering McCallum's pressure with counters of his own. That resilience is what earned him the draw, but he admitted later that it was one of the hardest fights of his life. They met again in 1994 at super middleweight. This time, Toney edged it with a narrow, unanimous decision, but the price was very costly, because McCallum's pressure didn't fade, and Toney had to fight really hard. By the third fight in 1996 at light heavyweight, both men were older, but the war remained grueling. That one also ended in a draw. Over 3 fights, Toney went 1-0-2 against McCallum. He got the better of the series on screen, but if you asked him who gave him the most grueling nights, McCallum was always at the top. He often said that McCallum's skill, pressure, and toughness demanded the absolute best out of him every single time. Fast forward to 2003, and James Toney had reinvented himself. He was 34 years old, undersized at heavyweight, but itching for a statement. That statement came in the form of Evander Holyfield. Holyfield was already a legend, a former undisputed champion, and one of the greatest warriors of the era. When Toney met him in Las Vegas, most people thought the smaller man was biting off more than he could chew. But Toney shocked the world. From the opening bell, Holyfield did what Holyfield always did: come forward, dig to the body, and test his opponent's resolve. Toney didn't back down. Instead, he answered with slick counters and body shots of his own. The fight was brutal. Toney later called it a dogfight. but his accuracy began breaking Holyfield down. By round 9, Holyfield was exhausted, worn out by the very tactics that had made him a legend. Toney dropped him with a left hook to the body, and moments later, the referee stopped it. That night revived Toney's career. He was named Fighter of the Year in 2003, but more than that, he proved that his chin and skill could withstand even a heavyweight legend. Still, the size difference was real. At barely 215 pounds, Toney was fighting uphill against a man who'd been carving up heavyweights for over a decade. Not every tough fight comes from raw power. Sometimes it's about style. That was the unique skill of Montel Griffin. He wasn't the hardest puncher, but his movement and ring IQ were enough to frustrate James Toney. Twice. Their first fight in 1995 saw Griffin outpoint Toney with slick movement and quick counters. Toney, known for his composure, struggled to cut the ring off effectively. The rematch in 1996 was more of the same. Once again, Griffin eked out a close, unanimous decision. For a man as proud as Toney, losing back-to-back fights in such fashion was painful. It wasn't about getting hurt or knocked out, but Griffin made him miss, made him think too much, and walked away with 2 wins. That kind of frustration comes with being a fighter. But if you want a fight that showcased both James Toney's brilliance and his toughness, look no further than his 2003 war with Vasily Girov. Girov was a relentless cruiserweight champion from Kazakhstan, known for his power and stamina. From the opening bell, he pressed Toney, throwing non-stop punches and targeting the body. At several points in the fight, Toney was wobbled. His legs buckled, his body shook, but he refused to go down. Round after round, it was a war. By the championship rounds, both men were exhausted, but Toney's counters began finding their mark. Then, in the final round, Toney landed a vicious right hand that dropped Girov. He got up, but the message was clear. Toney had survived the storm and delivered the exclamation point. That fight was named Fight of the Year, and for good reason. Toney's toughness kept him alive, and his skill turned the tide when it mattered most. By the mid-2000s, Toney was well into his heavyweight campaign, and the Nigerian powerhouse Samuel Peter was his opponent. Peter was a wrecking ball, one of the hardest hitters in the division, and Toney was already past his prime. Their first fight in 2006 was supposed to be Peter's coming-out party, but Toney's chin refused to crack. Round after round, Peter landed bombs that would have folded lesser men. Toney stood there, sometimes rolling with shots, sometimes eating them clean, and kept firing back. The judges gave Peter the decision. They met again in 2007, and once more, Peter's youth and power carried the night. In 2005, James Toney finally grabbed a piece of the heavyweight crown by defeating John Ruiz for the WBA title. Ruiz wasn't the most flashy fighter, but his size and awkward, clinch-heavy style made him a tough man to beat. Toney outboxed him, earning a unanimous decision, and what should have been one of the greatest triumphs of his career. But weeks later, disaster struck. Toney tested positive for stanozolol, a banned substance. He claimed it was for an arm injury, not performance enhancement, but the ruling stood. His win was overturned to a no contest, and his title stripped. That episode stung, not because Ruiz was the hardest man he ever fought, but because the fight that should have defined his heavyweight legacy was tainted forever. And then there was Merqui Sosa. Toney has often said that Sosa was the hardest puncher he ever faced. Sosa was no Hall of Famer, but his power was freakish. When they fought, Toney had to use every ounce of defensive craft to survive. He admitted later that Sosa's shots left him feeling them long after the fight. James Toney's career is full of names that tested him in different ways. Yet, James Toney never quitted, never got knocked out, and never stopped proving why he was one of the toughest men to ever lace up a pair of gloves. James Toney's current life. After nearly 3 decades in professional boxing, Toney stepped away in 2017 with a record of 77 wins, 10 losses, and 3 draws. He officially announced his retirement at the age of 48, though by then most people knew his fighting days were behind him. Retirement wasn't easy for him. Fighters who live for the roar of the crowd rarely slip quietly into normal life. And Toney has managed to stay connected to the sport in his own way. These days, he spends much of his time with his family, living a quieter life than the chaos of his prime. He has 6 children, and being a father and grandfather is a role he embraces fully. Those close to him say that his softer side comes out most when he's around his kids. Boxing is still in his blood, though. Toney is often seen at gyms, mentoring younger fighters and sharing wisdom that only comes from experience. He's never been the type to sugarcoat things, so his advice is blunt, raw, and real. Fighters who've trained around him say he pushes them to master defense and counterpunching the way he did, reminding them that boxing is as much about thinking as it is about hitting. His presence in gyms is his way of giving back to the sport that made him a legend. Life after boxing hasn't been without struggles. Like many fighters who spent decades taking punches, Toney has shown signs of slurred speech and slowed reflexes, symptoms often associated with long careers in combat sports. He's been open about the toll boxing has taken on his body, but insists he has no regrets. "I loved every minute of it," he once said. "I wouldn't change anything." That toughness alone gave off the regular vibe of James Toney. Financially, Toney isn't living the flashy life some fighters fall into after retirement. He never had the superstar paydays of Floyd Mayweather or Mike Tyson, but he managed to carve out a career that kept him secure. He still makes appearances at boxing events, fan conventions, and interviews, where his unfiltered personality always draws attention. Even in retirement, Toney can't help but stir debates with his strong opinions about today's fighters. What stands out most about his life now is the respect he continues to receive. He may not be a mainstream name in the casual sports world anymore, but within boxing circles, James Toney is revered. Fans still re-watch his fights with Mike McCallum, Vasily Girov, and Roy Jones Jr., pointing out the brilliance of his shoulder roll defense and his ability to stand in front of anyone without fear. Today, James Toney lives with the scars of his battles, but he also lives with the pride of knowing he never ducked anyone. He fought in almost every weight class, from middleweight to heavyweight, and he gave fans 3 decades of memories. His life now is quieter, slower, but it's also filled with the satisfaction of a man who truly left it all in the ring. So what do you think James Toney's legacy really says about boxing? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. We'll catch you in the next video.